I'm Emily and I'm from All Saints Church in Onslow Village in Guildford, and I've entered this competition because I thought it would be a good experience for me.
Are you afraid of the dark? I bet you've all been afraid of the dark at some point in your life. Or maybe you're still scared of it now. I must admit, I'm afraid of the dark. We associate darkness with many unpleasant things, like ghosts and fear, because, according to pretty much every horror film, bad things happen in the dark. Suddenly, as soon as the sun goes down, shadows seem to grow a couple of inches taller. Noises seem to echo louder and louder. But mainly, we're afraid because we can't see the dangers that would otherwise be obvious in the light. I suppose I'm more afraid of being alone and not having anyone to help me fight the monster under the bed. Perhaps I should ask for a nightlight this Christmas, just like in the John Lewis ad. In our Isaiah reading today, we have heard Isaiah's vision of a great light coming to a people who are walking in darkness. Poor Israelites, darkness was everywhere. Isaiah received this vision at a time when the Assyrians had declared war on Israel and had forced the Jews into captivity. The Israelites were suffering immense persecution, and to make life even worse, their crops failed. Being a community that relied primarily on agriculture, they found themselves in a very bleak situation, when they no doubt heavily questioned God's presence. A time, I would say, of spiritual darkness. We can also live in spiritual darkness. This is when we lack knowledge of or trust in God. We can feel alone and doubtful about God's presence in our lives. Isaiah's vision of a world full of peace, justice, and righteousness may seem far removed from our present lives. Leading up to Christmas, with the days getting shorter, colder, and darker, it can feel like a real struggle even getting up in the mornings. Or is that just me being a teenager? Work or school can feel never-ending. But at least we have Christmas to look forward to. For some people this year, and maybe even for many years, Christmas will be a very difficult time. We feel especially for those living on the streets and struggling with hunger as it gets colder and darker. And for families who are facing financial difficulties, the pressures on them around Christmas can be very great. It seems so unfair that some of us get to enjoy Christmas while others suffer. Where's the justice in that? There are two obvious responses to this. Firstly, we could ignore the problems in the world, put up our pretty twinkling fairy lights, buy a lot of comfort food to eat, and create a perfect little bubble for ourselves. Isaiah is certainly suggesting celebration. The people are rejoicing because a new light has dawned. But Isaiah's vision is in no way telling us to ignore those in need. So the other option is to get involved and to help. There are organisations like food banks and Practical Action that provide people with aid both locally and globally. But it's so unfair and sad that there is a need for these charities and that we have still no permanent solution to world poverty and violence. Our efforts can often feel like a drop in the ocean. Of course, it is good to help others, but if we rely solely on our own efforts, we risk despair if we don't succeed, and we can feel burnt out from trying so hard. We can feel that the Christian call to action is about us trying to relieve these injustices. But that's not actually Isaiah's full message at all. It is God who intervenes to relieve suffering. God has not abandoned the Israelites, just as he does not abandon us. In Isaiah's vision, God keeps his promise to the Israelites. The descendants of David will thrive. Isaiah's prophecy gave the Israelites the knowledge they needed to keep hope amidst their suffering. God's promise was that the light would dispel the darkness of the suffering. The Messiah would free the world from its injustice, violence, and sin. The Israelites will rejoice like the people rejoicing at a plentiful harvest. They will shatter the yoke of their oppression, and there will no longer be war, and so war clothes can be burnt. And the reason for this perfect picture of peace, Because God loves us so much that a child will be born, a tiny, helpless baby who will rule over us. He will carry our burdens on his shoulders. He will be a wonderful counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, and a Prince of Peace. Essentially, alongside looking after ourselves and helping others, we must put it in God's hands to solve our world problems. Jesus died on the cross, went into hell, and everything was dark. But he rose again, and he conquered death, he conquered sin, and he conquered darkness. Jesus is the light of the world, guiding humanity to a brighter future. This is the message that God is telling us. He's saying that he'll never abandon us, and that he loves us so much that he sacrificed his only Son to conquer our spiritual darkness. And if we turn to Jesus and trust in him, he will take our burden of suffering from us. Writing this sermon reminded me of a slightly bleak time in my life, when I sometimes doubted God's presence. 3 years ago, my younger brother was diagnosed with Crohn's disease, which stopped his body from being able to absorb nutrients. There is currently no cure, but with the help of amazing medication and regular checkups, Crohn's can be a very manageable condition. But for a few months before he was diagnosed, James was very sick, and the doctors couldn't work out what was wrong. He was in and out of hospital, and I remember visiting him in the Royal Surrey when he was most ill. We were all really fearful, and we didn't know who to turn to. His treatment also meant that he couldn't eat over Christmas. But when I questioned God's presence, the Christmas message and the birth of Jesus to save us from sin and suffering replaced my fear and restored my hope. Jesus, light of the world, shone through in the dark. Each year, the Christmas message gives me hope and positivity, and instead of reminding me of illness, I look forward to Christmas and celebrating the birth of Jesus. The presence of God equipped me for the next hurdle in my life, as the following April, when we thought things were looking up, my mum was diagnosed with breast cancer. But after chemo, an operation, and then radiotherapy, she was cancer-free. Even though the sickness came out of the blue, what surprised us the most was that we never felt alone. God was shining through other people's kindness and support for our family. I am so lucky that Mum and James both made a full recovery. But this reminded me that some people don't get better and have to wait longer for God's light to shine through. The poor Israelites had to wait 800 years for the Messiah to be born. Sometimes all we want is for God to hurry up. Finally, the most striking quote for me in this passage is, "For us a child is born, to us a son is given." Isaiah repeatedly says, "to us," showing that God's promise of a son is for both the Israelites and for everyone in the world today. And Christmas is a time that we can look forward to, even if our lives are far from perfect and God seems distant. However lovely a Christmas meal is and receiving wonderful gifts are, we mustn't miss the true message of Christmas. When the world needed it the most, God gave us the best present we could ever receive. He gave us Jesus, who is the love, the hope, and the light that never stops shining in the darkness.